Trump on the march to the White House. He is now the Republican presumptive presidential nominee. He's promising to make America great again. If he keeps on winning, how will President Trump affect the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. He's been derided by the international media and ridiculed by his own party. Now Donald Trump is set to become the Republican Party's presidential nominee 10 months after launching his unlikely bid for the White House. His critics say he is the least prepared candidate for president in modern American history. A man whose isolationist and xenophobic rhetoric is alarming to many at home and abroad. Yet his message resonates with many Americans. And U.S. allies and enemies alike are starting to consider how a Trump presidency would affect U.S. relations with the rest of the world. Well, Trump has summed up his foreign policy as an agenda to put America first. And he says he wants to stop the U.S. being humiliated abroad. Although he's been criticized for being light on substance, Trump insists he has more foreign policy experience than anyone else in the presidential race. Top of his agenda is containing the spread of what he calls radical Islam through what he said will be a philosophical and military struggle. He wants to spend more on rebuilding the U.S. military, what he calls the cheapest single investment. And Trump is keen to rebalance America's financial commitments with its allies, including NATO members. If he becomes president, he says he will renegotiate trade deals such as the North American Free Trade Agreement. And to the surprise of some, he said he will be open to making a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So let's bring in our guest then for this Inside Story. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Ryan Grim, the Washington bureau chief at the Huffington Post. In Silver Spring, Maryland, we have Shibley Telhami. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. And in London, James Boyes, Associate Professor of International Political Studies at Richmond University. Welcome, all of you. James Boyes, let me start with you. What might Trump foreign policy look like, in your opinion, if he does become president?
Well, it's rather difficult to be specific because, of course, Donald Trump has been very, very vague when it comes to talking about foreign policy issues. I'm sure some of your viewers will recall that a little over a week or so ago, he gave what he was announcing was going to be a major foreign policy speech. And most commentators who watched that came away, if not puzzled and outright concerned, quite frankly, at the vague quality of what Donald Trump was talking about. It's important to recognize, of course, that in the course of a presidential campaign, all candidates will come out with some statements with regard to what their foreign policy may or may not look like. And all too often, of course, events, personalities and circumstances change by the time they become president. In 2000, of course, Governor George Bush talked about having a relatively scaled back foreign policy. And then, of course, events overtook his administration and led to, of course, a rather more expansive foreign policy than perhaps he or his followers might well have imagined. So when we consider a Donald Trump presidency and its foreign policy, we need to recognize that at the moment we're talking about a degree of bluster and campaign rhetoric, which may or may not be transmitted and transferred into policy if he were to become the next president of the United States. But certainly he would be inclined, I think, to have a far more expansionist, aggressive foreign policy than perhaps we have seen in the last 8 years.
Well, Ryan Grim, let's talk more about that point that James was making there about the difference between the rhetoric in the campaign and what happens when you govern. I mean, it is often said, isn't it, that the politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Is there a possibility then that should Trump become president, the reality of governing will set in and he'll have to pursue a perhaps more measured foreign policy?
I've never heard Donald Trump's campaign style called poetry before. You know, it's kind of a breakthrough experimental style, if it is poetry. But your point is a good one. I mean, first, people should know that the chance that he actually wins the general election is vanishingly small. You know, he probably has the the slimmest chance to win of a major party figure in 100 years in the United States. Now, if he does win,
well, to be fair, people said that about him getting the Republican nomination a little less than a year ago.
They did say that, but the factors that led to him getting the Republican nomination don't hold as well for the general nomination. In other words, the type of kind of racism and anger that elevated him is concentrated in among Republican primary voters rather than in the general election, and he has something like 70% approval ratings, close to 80% disapproval ratings with women. So that makes it a very, very difficult climb. But like you said, anything can happen. Anything did happen in the primary, so it's possible. I agree that it's very difficult to read what his foreign policy would be like. Judging from his character, I would guess that it would be much more of a reactive foreign policy, that he doesn't have some kind of, and that's how his campaign has been. It's been reactive. He doesn't have an overarching campaign strategy. He hasn't had an overarching strategy for his life, for his career, and I don't think he would have one for foreign policy. He certainly hasn't articulated one. Instead, I think he would wait for events to unfold and kind of react instinctually to them. And I think that's a reason that so many people are worried about what those reactions would be.
Shibley, Telhami, what's your view on this? I mean, what does it say about Americans at the moment and how they see the rest of the world, that whatever you may think of Trump, that so many people are buying into his worldview?
Well, first of all, let me just say that, well, of course, if you had to put your money right now, you'd put it on Hillary Clinton. She obviously, for all the reasons that were just suggested, I think, she has the edge. But on the other hand, I mean, it's not just what he did in the primaries and what people said, but he's obviously capturing a mood, and the mood is pervasive across the political spectrum. Certainly Sanders is capturing the same mood. And, when you look at the polls that have him against Hillary or against Sanders, yeah, they have the Democrats winning, but not surprisingly, not by shockingly large percentage, which seems to suggest that as this goes on, things can change, and I think Hillary has to take him seriously. Democrats have to take him seriously. Now, in terms of his foreign policy outlook, I would say I don't expect him to be expansionist and aggressive at all, actually. In fact, if there's any kind of surprise, there are a lot of surprises. Obviously, this is a candidate who didn't have any experience. He's the first non-politician to be selected as a presumptive nominee of a major party since Eisenhower, but the main thing that is surprising to me is that he took on the party orthodoxy on major issues such as the Iraq War, which is something extremely unpopular, or so people thought. He took them on. Even on the Arab-Israeli issue, where he sort of flip-flopped a little bit. He was unorthodox. He is more of an isolationist than he's an interventionist. He certainly doesn't want to be dragged into war, and so in that sense, it's actually rather surprising that message actually gained traction within the Republican Party. And I frankly think that in the general election, he's going to sound a little bit more to the left of center of Hillary Clinton, because he's going to take her on the Iraq War, and probably on her recommendations for Syria or for Libya. So I think it's hard to predict. My own worry about him isn't really what is said in the campaign, because we know campaigns. People say what they want to say, and I don't really take them seriously, because I know that people will change. What I worry about in his case is he's entirely unpredictable. He is very offensive, and when you're president, offensive to people and culture, that has a lot, it says a lot. And third, the inexperience is really troubling. I mean, this is, it's one thing to be a real estate tycoon, another thing to be president of the United States of America, acting in the world. And I think it's hard to know, especially since he's anti-establishment, who are the people who he's going to bring in to advise him.
We'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a moment. I want to bring up some of the main themes of Trump's foreign policy now. A big one, of course, is China. Donald Trump says China has waged what he calls economic war on the United States, and he's talked about increasing tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, when asked about the prospect of a Trump presidency, China's foreign ministry spokesman urged Americans to be rational about the relationship between the two countries. Take a listen now.
The US presidential election is an internal matter for the US which we can't comment on. What needs to be pointed out is that the essence of the Sino-US trade and business cooperation is mutually beneficial and a win-win. It accords with the interests of both sides. We hope people in the US can rationally and objectively view this relationship.
Ryan Grimm, we heard the usual diplomatic disclaimer there at the beginning that, you know, we don't get involved in domestic policies of other countries. But if we kind of read into this a little bit more, what he said at the end there about the need to look at this in a rational and sensible way, that is kind of a dig at Trump, isn't it?
Oh, certainly. And you know, like has been said earlier, whether or not Trump wins, you know, this has expressed or exposed an expression of a deep-seated anger and animosity that exists within a certain population of the United States with China, and that is the concern that you're seeing reflected in the foreign minister's comments there. You know, no country wants to be on the receiving end of that kind of anger, particularly not from a country as powerful as the United States. So you see this effort to say, look, you know, our trade deals aren't bad. The trade deficit is actually mutually beneficial for both countries. So I think in some ways it's a wake-up call for China that a lot of the United States population is deeply unsettled about the way that things have unfolded in America over the last 40 years, and they place a lot of blame on China as kind of the proxy for a lot of the collapse of the middle class and the collapse of manufacturing and this belief that that things just aren't as great as they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, Shibley, Telhami, let's pick up on some of that. I mean, taking on China, blaming trade with China for America's ills. I mean, the fact is, though, many Americans have lost good manufacturing jobs over the years because of that. Has he touched on a raw nerve here?
Well, he obviously has touched on a raw nerve, and it's, you know, you could see that Sanders is touching on the same raw nerve, and obviously Trump is going to hope that he's going to attract some people from the Democratic Party, particularly the so-called Reagan Democrats, who might be attracted to this protectionist kind of worldview. But it's easier said than done. I mean, the question is, you know, how is he going to put that without generating a trade war that is devastating? He hasn't said how this could work. Obviously, it's worrying the Chinese. I think it is. It's true that you know, Chinese have to be worried not simply about Trump, but the fact that there is a public mood that blames them and sees them as a problem, and isn't taken into account kind of the international trade agreements as much as they would like. But I do think that his message obviously is resonating. There's something, you know, this is why I say I think you have to take him seriously, even though he's alienated women, he's alienated Hispanics, he's alienated Muslims, he's alienated all kinds of segments of the public. But when you look at it, he's still winning among those segments within the Republican Party. He's probably not going to win a lot of them, but if he, you know, Democrats will need probably 80–90% vote from African Americans. If he can even manage to get 15 to 20% of African Americans, he can do pretty well. So he doesn't have to win all these segments that are essentially core segments of the Democratic Party. He just has to attract a solid enough minority to be able to turn around. And his message is powerful. And I think, you know, Hillary Clinton is going to have to find an answer, and possibly and certainly Sanders is pushing her, and I think he's staying in the campaign not because he thinks he can win at this point, but because I think they want to push that agenda at the Democratic National Convention this summer.
James Boyce, how is this whole debate about China being viewed in Europe right now, particularly with Donald Trump? I mean, are there some similarities there that you can compare it to in Europe?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, here in Europe, we have our own trade issues coming up with the United States. We in London and across the United Kingdom are going to vote shortly upon whether to stay within the European Union. We've had Barack Obama here within the last 10 days urging UK citizens to vote not to go with the Brexit option and talking about the potential impact that such a move would have upon US-UK trade negotiations and status. There's no doubt, I think, that when we think about the position with regard to Europe, the United States and trade, we've got some very, very serious questions to be asked with regard to the future direction of our own relationship with the United States on that issue. When I think about what it is that Donald Trump has said with regard to China in this election cycle, I'm reminded to a certain extent about something that a young Bill Clinton said in 1992 when he was campaigning for the presidency, when he tried to leverage the potential direction of his future foreign policy vis-a-vis China with regard to something called MFN, which is most favored nation trading status, suggesting that if the Chinese leadership wanted to be on good terms in Washington under his administration, that it would need to sharpen up its act with regard to human rights. And of course, we saw the Chinese leadership very, very coolly respond to that and do very, very little to a point whereby the United States had to back down rather embarrassingly with regard to that. Now, over the course of its 8 years in office, the Clinton administration was able to come round and bring China into the World Trade Organization. But that took a number of years to achieve. It took a lot of diplomatic maneuvering on behalf of Washington to back down from its rather aggressive stance. That is not in any way, of course, to compare what Bill Clinton is saying with regard to Donald Trump's rather brisk and outlandish language with regard to China, but merely to draw the point that we have seen American presidential candidates try to beat the China stick in the past, only to have to come back down to reality and to deal with a very, very powerful Chinese lobby, a Chinese trading bloc, which of course holds a great number of aces with regard to American debt. It must be pointed out the relationship between China and the United States is not favorable necessarily to Washington, and it's going to be very, very clear that Donald Trump is going to have to be a very, very clever diplomatic trick moving forward with regard to China.
All right, I want to move on then to the Middle East. Shibley, Telhami, I mean, we've heard quite a bit from Trump already on this, and I know you've talked about some of it. He pledged a major build-up of the military and the swift destruction of ISIL, but he pointedly rejected the kind of nation-building that was espoused by George W. Bush in his presidency. I mean, do you see a kind of a contradiction there?
Oh, there's no question. There are a lot of contradictions of what he says about the Middle East, and actually a lot of contradictory reactions coming to the Middle East because not everybody sees them in the same way. For example, the anti-interventionist message, I think, resonates with a good chunk of the Arab public opinion, which isn't necessarily the position of the governments, and it resonates with some positions of governments like the Egyptian government, his anti-interventionist position, as well as his anti-state building and regime change position, which resonates with a number of governments. So his language against Muslims obviously has alienated a lot of people and had distanced people who were, he thought of themselves as their allies. Because, you know, Donald Trump is well known to a lot of people in the Middle East. He's an international businessman. He makes deals with the economic elites in the region. He knows them personally. They know him. They like him. They think they can make deals with him. He knows a lot of the leaders. I met with one Arab leader, I wouldn't mention his name, who knew him very well, and he said, you know, he can do business with him. He was very uncomfortable with his statements, but everybody wants to distance themselves. But I don't think the reaction to him is quite as bad as people think, because I think a lot of rulers in the Middle East who think they can do business with him and who are not going to go publicly and say that just because
Who
of
would
his
those rulers be in your view,
statements.
just out of interest?
Well, I mean, for example, I think, you know, talking about the Egyptian ruling elites, they're comfortable with many of his positions. He doesn't want He doesn't want to send American forces. He's taken a position against the Iraq war. He says the Libya war was a big mistake, which Trump takes that on. He wants to pressure Iran, but he obviously doesn't want to go to war with Iran. Is exactly where the Egyptian position is. He doesn't want regime change. He wants to focus on Islamic movements, radical Islamic movements, exactly what many of the regimes, including the Egyptian regime, preach. So all of that, you find, I think, it looks like they all don't want him, but I think it's a mixed picture.
All right. Ryan Grimm, I mean, Donald Trump has also been critical. He's been very critical of President Obama, of course. His intervention in Libya, which he says has left a security vacuum occupied by ISIL now. He's faulted him for not enforcing the red line that he himself had laid down in Syria. And this is something, I mean, Trump's not the first person to highlight this. This is something that prominent people in Obama's own Democratic Party have mentioned.
Right, and what he does is he tries to kind of tie together President Obama's strategy in the Middle East with George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, saying that the United States is overextending itself, it's getting in too many adventures in Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and that its effort to try to bring democracy to the region is a failure. And so he kind of colors them all with the same brush there and says, I won't do that. And exactly to Shibley's point, that those are actually words that a lot of the leaders, particularly in the Gulf countries, are happy to hear. They don't necessarily want to see the United States trying to bring democracy or trying to kind of rile up protesters who might be demanding more rights for civil society. And Trump has been extremely clear about his affection for strongmen. He makes that clear not just in the Middle East, but with Vladimir Putin, for instance. There's a kind of a new leader around the country that fits the mold of somebody like an Erdogan, a Modi, a Putin, some of the Gulf leaders, and Donald Trump. They kind of have a lot of the trappings of democracy, but are rather illiberal regimes, and it's clear that that's the model that Trump appreciates more than the others.
Sure, I want to bring that point then to James about his liking for so-called strongmen like Putin, and he said that he admires Putin and that he's someone that he can, in his words, make deals with. How is that likely to go down in Europe, given relations between Western Europe and Russia right now have been at their worst at this point?
Yeah, indeed. I think it's interesting to hear Donald Trump talk about this idea of his affection for the strong man, the great man approach to history, of course, attempting by extension to portray himself in that sort of category. That obviously speaks a lot, I think, to Donald Trump's ego-driven approach to life and to politics at this point. I think that when you see the sort of personalities that are at play across the European continent at this point, it's easy to see how a President Trump could come in and very much dominate proceedings. There's not necessarily a strong co-equal across the European continent. And of course, by the time he were to assume office, Angela Merkel's time might well be drawing to a close. We'd almost certainly have a new leader here in the United Kingdom. There's no sign of a particular strong candidate coming out of France. So the ability for Donald Trump to potentially very much act as a unifying central figure within the West vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin is easy to see. I have to say I completely agree with Ryan's concept about how difficult it is going to be for Donald Trump to ever become president. But if we're assuming that that is a scenario to assess in the future, then it's easy to see how he could attempt to straddle, I think, both the American and the European continent in such a strongman approach, which would run counter, it must be said, to how it is that a liberal interpretation of history has attempted to portray history in recent years. Very much, I think, trying to set himself up almost as a sort of a Teddy Roosevelt for the early 21st century, if you will.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. Fascinating discussion, gentlemen. Ryan Grimm, Shibley, Telhami, and James Boyce, thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And as always, thank you for watching. Remember, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.